Zoom there, and I'm going to mute everybody. You got yourselves muted ready? No, I'll do it for you. Okay, so I want to explain what we're going to do tonight and in subsequent weeks. Someone left me a voice note yesterday and used the word subsequent to pronounce subsequent. No, subsequent. Anyways, you don't need to know all these things. So what we're going to do tonight, Bezrat Hashem, we're going to conclude the section having to do with World War I and the Jews. It's going to be a kind of a mix tonight. We're going to do both the non-Jewish perspective and the Jewish perspective. And then we're going to begin a section of what's called the interwar years, which will begin next week, hopefully, the time between the two wars, which will take us, my guess is at least a couple of months. Plus, we're going to be going to the break with the Chagim, so it's going to be a while to get through this. And my plan is to take that section of the interwar years up to January 1939 when Hitler comes to power. And it's a lot of information, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'm going to start at the end. What does it mean, the end? The end of World War I. November 11th, 1918, there's an armistice. The war officially ended, but the killing may have ended, but the crisis and crises that were going on in most of Europe, especially in Russia and Europe, had not come to any kind of an end. And the territories in which, obviously, without question, the territories in which the Jews lived, where most of the world's Jewry lived, the violence just actually intensified after World War I. There were revolutions. There was the Russian Revolution, brought civil war, and with that, a new wave of pogroms, because the ones that happened before and during World War I against the Jews, they weren't enough. So they had to have new and improved pogroms against the Jews. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire gave a new potential future for what was known then as Palestine. Because remember, Israel was under the rule of the Turks at the time. The redrawing of the map of Europe due to the Paris Paris Peace Conference. We're going to talk about all this, kind of just a little overview. New states, new minority problems. Every time you come up with a new country, now just again, let's put a parenthesis here for a second, but we're going to talk about when they divide up Europe differently than it looked before World War I. It's not ancient. First of all, it's not ancient history. It's not that long ago history. But number two, for those of us who literally watch communism, the communist countries fall apart on TV, and the domino effect of that, and then the redrawing of the map of Europe then again, so we understand what at least this idea is. Jews, the world that the Jews experienced prior to 1914 was gone. That was over. The world they faced now, though, in many ways was more dangerous, more unstable, and more hostile to the Jews. You would think that after the war is over, that maybe things would calm down for the Jews, but no, they don't. And this is our story for centuries. One of the most dramatic consequences of the First World War is the simultaneous collapse of four great empires. Now, we're going to look at all four. We're also going to look at how it affected the Jews. Very often, many people are familiar with the fact that at the end of World War I, there was what was to be known the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles and all these other things we're going to talk about, and the things shifted around. But losing, that's like a macro view, a micro view, really looking under a microscope. When you zoom out and you look at what was and what became of Europe, and we're going to see a map in a little while, just one map. It's incredible what was actually going on. Four separate empires come to an end: the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Almost simultaneously, come to an end. And imagine for a moment, put it in perspective. We do have empires today, but not the same kind we're talking about now. But imagine, let's just say, all of a sudden that the Russian, the country of Russia, just all of a sudden ceases to exist as a country, and also the United States breaks up into multiple states, which are countries, which may happen one day, and South Africa, whatever, and Africa breaks into dozens of other. It's just these massive changes that are taking place. But it's not just that the countries are being born and being recreated, and new borders are being created, those people that held the rule over all those countries as a single unit, that's come to come apart. Each collapse of each one of those four empires has profound implications, obviously, for the Jews that had lived under imperial rule. The word imperial means the word empire, under imperial rule. And we're going to talk about each one a little bit. Let's talk first about the German Empire. It's probably the most consequential for the future. Well, now, what do I mean by that? I'm going to jump ahead for 1 second. It will become clear when we start talking about World War II, the interwar period. There are different schools of thought. Was World War I and World War II, were they really one long war with a break in between of X amount of years? Were they two separate events? Was the Second World War a foregone conclusion? Again, we'll talk about all that in its time. But the fact that the German Empire fell apart, and not just fell apart, but in a disastrous way for Germany, in an embarrassing way for Germany, becomes the fuel for the fire for this man, of course, known as Hitler. It will be automatically assumed from any point on I talk about his name, it's Yamach Shemo. His name be blotted out forever. So the German Empire falls apart in November 1918 and is replaced by the Weimar Republic. It's a name you may know because if you know anything Holocaust history and all, we're going to be talking about that extensively down the road. But they were the first democratically established government in Germany in centuries. Unfortunately, it was established in the worst possible conditions because the creation of the Weimar Republic was a response to a terrible military defeat and national humiliation, which again, Hitler will take to heart. It will be one of his main reasons for leading on to whatever's going to eventually happen. The people who signed, which is interesting, the people who signed the Armistice Treaty, basically capitulating to the Allied forces, were referred to in German mythology as the November criminals, because they felt that they stabbed the Germans in the back by doing this. Anti-Semites, of course, pointed out to the very prominent role that Jews had in the German revolutionary movement, and that the defeat had been engineered by the Jews. It's always the Jews, the Jews. You saw what's going on in Morocco with this one little piece of area that, not Morocco, but next to Morocco is one little piece of land that Spain owns. This colonizing people who should really think about a two-state solution. Oh, never mind. And all these people, this 40, 50,000 migrants that burst into the country, and a lot of them got killed, a lot of them went back, and there have been over 10 million views on one or two people's, I think it was Instagram, that say it was Israel and the Jews that arranged to have all these people crash into the country in order to cause problems for Spain. It's always the Jews. The stab in the back legend, though, was really false because Germany really had been militarily defeated in the field. But it was a political piece that was played. That was as the Jews, blame the Jews. Why would we want to blame ourselves when we have a scapegoat? And that will become one of the central myths upon which Hitler will build his empire. So the German Empire is the first one to fall. Second one is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It dissolved entirely, and it was replaced by multiple countries: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, a larger Poland, Romania. Again, countries that if none of us lived in 1918. That would, if you did, it'd make you over 100 years old right now, and I'd like to meet you. But these are countries that we know of today. Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore because of 1991, approximately, with the fall of communism, it gets chopped up into multiple, along with others, to multiple countries, Serbia and Croatia and all these other countries. And a large Poland, we'll see what that means. I don't know about you, but it took me years after the fall of communism to stop saying the Ukraine. Now, I mean, it's easy. It's been years, but it was the Ukraine for so many years in our brains when it was still in this part of the Soviet Union. But one of the things that was happening in Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, the enlarged Poland, They all, at the end of the war and moving forward, needed to have some people to blame. Even though things are working better for them in some ways economically, the fact that they have part of their countries are in ruin, et cetera, they needed so they mistreat their minorities in their countries, of course, including the Jews. But it wasn't just the Jews. The Jews in the former Habsburg lands now find themselves in divided among multiple new states. Imagine for a moment that their country of Fredonia. For those of you who are Marx Brothers aficionados, you'll know it's a pretend country like Palestine. So there's a country called Fredonia, and there's Jews all over the country. And then they divide up Fredonia into four different new countries. Well, instead of your cousin and your friend and your brother is just like down the road in part of Fredonia, now he's in a different country. And that's what was happening. And each one of those new countries had their own policies toward their Jewish citizens, none of which were that tolerant. I know you're shocked, but that's what happened. That what was going on when the Austro-Hungarian Empire was divided up. Then we're going to talk about the Russian Empire. I had a teacher in high school who I think because of him I really started to like history in my sophomore year, and I know he didn't coin this phrase. I didn't look up who said it, but that they say about but way before this time period, obviously thousands of years before, that the Holy Roman, it wasn't thousands. The Holy Roman Empire was neither holy, nor was it Roman, nor was it an empire. How you define exactly an empire, it could be for different discussion. But right now, let's just use the word. The Russian Empire's collapse was the most complex and most directly consequential for the Jews. Keep in mind, we talked about last time and before that, this concept of the Pale of Settlement, where the Jews were more or less confined to an area of land. It wasn't a small area, but relative to the size of Russia, it was quite small. There's a revolution in 1917, February 1917, and became a provisional government that took power. Immediately after that happened, they abolished all legal restrictions for Jews. Hey, it looked great. It was the first time in who knows how many centuries Jews actually had full civic equality for the first time in absolutely a very, very long time after the fall of the Russian Empire. And that was an extraordinary moment. The dream of I can't speak tonight. The dream of Jewish emancipation. It was amazing. All the problems they had had before and everything else almost seemed for a moment like a distant reality. Ha ha ha. But countries around the world never miss an opportunity to take advantage. The provisional government lasted. Okay, maybe I should go and let me take a drink. It's water. Lasted only 8 months until it was overthrown by the Bolsheviks in the October Revolution of November 1917. And the idea of so you're talking only from February till November, this provisionary government lasted. And the October Revolution, 1917, and the Bolshevik Revolution, which, by the way, you can give weeks and weeks of classes on. People write their doctorate on it all. I'm not interested in it, just how, in this case, how it affected the Jews. So what happened after the Bolsheviks come to power, and again, if you want to know what they are more about the Bolsheviks and the revolution and the Russian Revolution, feel free to go online and read. I would just mention as an aside, I don't think I've mentioned this in any class, maybe a couple of you have told us to. In 1974, maybe 73, I don't remember. I had an aunt who lived in Leningrad / St. Petersburg, depends what time of history it was, who came to Chicago for 5 weeks and stayed with us. And at that time, it was the Soviet Union. And I'm not going to go into the whole thing about when she was there with us. She spent 5 weeks with us, and she didn't speak English, and we didn't speak Russian. So my parents communicated with her in Yiddish. And she spoke Yiddish because that's what she grew up with. My parents both spoke Yiddish. Neither of whom were European, or were. And they communicated, and I picked up a lot of Yiddish because of that. But I found it very frustrating that I couldn't communicate directly with her. So somehow through sign language and my parents translating, she and I, my aunt and I made a pact. She would go back to Russia and learn English, and I would learn Russian. And I lived just a few blocks away from a local college, which is now a real university. At that time, it was much smaller. And my next door neighbor was a professor of language in the university, and she gave me access to the language lab for the summer plus into the next school year. And over the course of the summer and the next school year, I taught myself to read and write, to carry on conversations in Russian, and also I ended starting writing letters to my aunt in Russian, and she responded to me in English. So, and I mean, I can still read and write and speak a little bit, but I don't use it. But if I would spend 3, 4 months probably in Moscow, it would come, it's in there, it's in the brain. I love language. So the things like watching the movie Dr. Zhivago or any of the Russian type of Russian revolution movies and all that, it always appealed to me. But my goal here is not to talk about my language, but to talk about, how did this affect the Jews? Well, as they say, is it good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? And following the Bolshevik Revolution, there were 3 years of catastrophic civil war, foreign intervention, famine. Approximately 8 to 10 million people were killed in the what was known as the former Russian Empire. There's no more Tsar. There's no many of that anymore. If you're interested in knowing a little bit about the Tsar, the Tsarina, and the killing of the Romanov family, and all, is also fascinating. And out of those 8 to 10 million people, an enormous number of Jews were also killed. Not millions, but a tremendous amount of people were killed. And the Civil War was fought between the Bolshevik Red Army and the White Armies, again, with Ukrainian nationalists involved, warlords and Polish forces, and like everyone wanted to get in that game. All sides in that war, no matter which, it was the White Army, the Red Army, the Ukrainians, the Polish. One of the things they all had in common, that even though they were fighting each other, was anti-Jewish violence at some point. But the White Army, the Russian White Army, and the Ukrainian forces were probably responsible for the most sustained and systemic attacks. From the category of nothing changes in history, if you remember, we talked about Khmelnytsky and what was known as Gzerot Tach V'Tat, that happened a few hundred years before this, Ukraine. It was horrific for the Jews. Tens of thousands of Jews murdered. Babi Yar and everything that happened later on, which we'll get to when we talk about World War II. It's the Ukraine is Ukraine is stained like Poland with tremendous amounts of Jewish blood. The pogroms of that time period were extremely ferocious, and ad kedei kach that historians say that they're probably the worst Jewish pogroms with no precedent prior to that. And that's saying a lot because of Gzerot Tach V'Tat when Khmelnytsky was doing his business until World War II, until the Holocaust began. The wave of violence that came through Ukraine between 1918 and 1921 are estimates between 50,000 and 200,000 Jews were murdered. Because we live in a time of post-Holocaust, and it's been 80 years, let's just round off the number, 80 years. We think in terms of the Holocaust as the benchmark for the murder of Jews. Even after the 7th of October, and you still hear the refrain today, that date was the worst day of Jews being murdered since the Holocaust in one day. True. But some people forget that before the Holocaust, there were many Holocausts along the way. Many of them, like I say, Ukraine and Poland and Russia, the Pale of Settlement. And the numbers weren't small. In the mythical Anatevka, they may have, killed 25 people or 35 people. And I don't want to minimize that. But compared to 50,000 up to 200,000 potentially. And again, we know that the numbers are astronomical in what happens in Babi Yar over a period of a couple. I was actually in Babi Yar twice and stood at the ravine where the Jews were massacred. And just as a slight digression, I don't know if any of you, those of you who have been, you'll know what I'm talking about. But until I went to Poland and went to see the camps and other places in the Ukraine to go to see a place like Babi Yar, I always thought it's out in the middle of the nowhere. They would take the Jews by truck and by train, and they massacred them where they massacred them. And you find out, you go to Ukraine and you go to Babi Yar, that they, during the period of a couple of days, of Rosh Hashanah and plus, that tens of thousands of Jews were literally marched through the city, and when they got to the others to the ravine in the Babi Yar forests, were murdered there. So again, nothing is unique in Jewish history. For those of you who know, some of you know, I was today with the mother of Agam Berger, one of the former, thank God, hostages. Spent about an hour and a half with her today, presented her with something I'd written, talked for quite a long time. It's a beautiful meeting, but confirmed what everyone knows, which is that Agam had been held both in a tunnel and also in homes. And she said these homes that not only, and there were families with kids in the homes when she was there, and not only did they not raise a finger to help, that's why I say that they're all bad, every one of them. But she would actually sit there and watch when the little kids would play instead of when you play in the United States, cops and robbers and Indians and whatever, and chiefs. It was kill the Jews. She would sit there and watch that with her own eyes. That's what her mother told me. So again, it's in the blood. It's in the blood of so many, unfortunately, so many throughout history. But this idea before World War II and post World War I also, but especially before World War I and during the early days after the armistice, these numbers were incomprehensible of deaths of Jews before World War II. Entire communities were massacred. Women were raped on mass scale. The social fabric of the Jewish people in the Ukraine, Jewish life in Ukraine was just absolutely devastated. The memory of the pogroms haunted the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe and for the diaspora for the entire interwar period, and that helped shape political choices, whether it came to Zionism, immigration, emigration, support for Bolshevism, lack of support for Bolshevism, and it affected the interwar years leading up to World War II in a tremendous way. It was how, again, put it into our perspective, it's really important for us to it's not just these experiences of these people, these are our experiences too, because ad hayom hazeh, till this very day, how are we, you and I, and those listening to this at a later date, how are we, what colors our day as a result of October 7th? You know, at any moment, you know, something can start again. You get this screeching warning, you know, like, hey, you might want to be near your mamad. And it probably will happen again. But and the idea, like we're supposed to whatever, we're supposed to do something, let's say in November or in October, and still no, Bezrat Hashem, and we'll see how things go. Because it's not just the usual Bezrat Hashem, it's the usual Bezrat Hashem plus who knows what's going to happen next. So everything that happened since October 7th and the war, which is still going, it colors our lives. And these people who were massacred and communities wiped off the face of the earth, that played into the psyche of the people at that point as well, and helped make decisions of what would end up happening. It affects people like Menachem Begin eventually, and Usishkin, and just all the names you know of what's in the background, what comes up. So that's why it's so important to understand this time period and the post-war period, and the post-war and the interwar period rather. So it'll help fashion the psyche of people who eventually are the ones who fight for the land of Israel before, which is Palestine, becomes land of Israel, and it traces its history back to this time period. So let's talk about the Paris Peace Conference and the rights for Jews. I want to first put on the screen a map. Copy. Let me first get it on my screen before I share it. Paste. Boom. And I want to make this big if I can. No, I can't. Oh, there I can. Just make it a little bit smaller. Hold on, bear with me for 1 second. I didn't have this set before I came in. Okay. Here, let me go to screen share. Share map. Okay, this is Europe pre-World War I and post-World War I. You'll notice Germany's over here, Italy, that didn't change. Here's France and Spain and Portugal. Poor little Spain, all these people breaking into their little country, poor babies. Here's the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You'll notice you don't see the word Poland anywhere here, right? Here's Russia, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, all these countries you've heard of. Here's Albania. And then you come over here. That's before World War I. Now come over here and you see, oh, we have new countries. Poland all of a sudden exists as a country. Here you have, there's no Austro-Hungary. There's Austria, there's Hungary, there's Yugoslavia. There was no Yugoslavia here. There was Serbia, right? And all kinds of other stuff. In Albania, now you have Czechoslovakia. You have Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria. No longer, it's not Russia, it's the United Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, the Soviet Union. And now, again, of course, we know today there's dozens of countries that are made up of what was called the former Soviet Union. But now Poland's on the map, which, of course, is going to play a huge part in World War II with Germany's invasion of Poland and really the beginning of World War II. Not the stuff leading up to it, but the actual beginning. So this is a huge change in the face of Europe, especially Eastern Europe I'm talking about. Partially Western Europe, because you have Germany over here with Switzerland, but Germany, and then Germany, smaller, and you have this Czechoslovakia, Austria. Okay, enough of that. Tough. It's back here. Tough. So the Paris Peace Conference produced what was known as the Treaty of Versailles. That's the same room where President Trump was just a number of months ago signing all kinds of treaties. And the Treaty of Versailles is what formally ended in 1919. It formally ended the war, and even though there was an armistice, there wasn't an official treaty, there wasn't an official end yet, and redrew the map of Europe, which we just took a look at. It was also one of the most attended mix of people, various nationalities, ethnicities, political groups, all seeking recognition. Rather, keep in mind, again, we see the result. We see the map. It's not like they came with that, okay, here's what we're going to do. This is what's going to, that was part of the negotiation. And as we know here in Israel, a millimeter here, a millimeter there on a map makes a massive difference of where your border is. Is your border here? Is your border there? Is it go up to this far north, this far south? And then there are border disputes and all. And which is also why during the war, both the First and the Second World War, people found themselves under different, I'd say these were governments. But among those who came to the Paris Conference, again, which led to the Treaty of Versailles, representatives of the Jewish people. And they also represented different approaches, different views, different demands, different visions. The American Jewish Congress, organized through a very specific democratic process, it mobilized Eastern European immigrants and sent a delegation to France from the United States that included Louis Marshall. Name that might sound familiar to you. Also famous Judge Julian Mack, both of whom, and the American Jewish Committee, AJC, associated with the Zionist movement. European Jewish organizations also sent their own representatives. Zionists sent Weizmann, Sokolov. They lobbied for British support in Palestine, international recognition of the Balfour Declaration, which we talked about last week and we're going to still hopefully talk about tonight and what happens with it. But all the Jewish delegations who came with all their different demands and their requests and their hopes and their dreams and everything else had one immediate demand, no matter where they came from, and that was the protection of Jewish minority rights in the new states of Central and Eastern Europe. They understood part of the job, the goal of the Paris Peace Conference was the eventual Treaty of Versailles, which was going to chop up Europe. But they said, whatever country, who's under whoever rule we will be, we need to ensure that part of that agreement is that we're going to have rights. The minority rights treaties were actually incorporated into the Paris settlement. And it really was, at that point, a pretty big, strong advance for the Jews. The new states of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania, Hungary, others were required by this peace conference to guarantee equal civic rights to minorities, not just Jews, to minorities. They were also allowed to have their own schools, their own courts, their own cultural institutions. There was an organization called the League of Nations. It's a misconception that the League of Nations morphed into the UN, but in a sense, it kind of did. I don't want to get into that tonight, but it went from a nice organization that morphed into a pretty good organization to an organization that is of institutional anti-Semitism, which is today. literally. However, in spite of the peace conference, in spite of the treaties, in spite of everything in writing, in practice, we say tachlis, minority rights are definitely flawed and mostly ineffective. The new states resented the treaties. They felt it was an infringement on their sovereignty. Imagine for a moment, it's forced on Israel that I don't use Israel. I won't bring any Hara. It's forced on Georgia, the country, not the state. On Georgia, they're going to have to chop it in half, and then half of it's owned by Russia now, and they're going to put it in there. And the Georgians are still living there. Like, what about us? They didn't have a say in the matter. It was the heads of state that were taking care of this, the allied powers and the losing people. So they resented the treaties. And the sovereignty that was being infringed upon, that they felt was being infringed upon. And reluctantly and very unevenly, they would apply these so-called civic or civil rights, and they found all kinds of ways around them. Again, I want to stress, it wasn't, we think in terms of Jewish history, the Jews, but all the minorities in these countries suffered the similar fate, except, of course, the pogrom aspect. That was reserved for the Jews. Poland, which is the home for the world's largest Jewish community, which at that point, before World War II, at the end of World War I, had approximately 3.5 million Jews, was a particularly difficult, troubling situation. We talked about this topic before, and it really has a very big impact here. It's called nationalism. It's very much about being all for your country, very patriotic for your country, to the exclusion of those who are not as patriotic and or outliers. They don't belong. It was intensely Catholic in Poland, with a very, very anti-Semitic component. And because of that, Jews were excluded from, and this paves the way for the Nuremberg laws and everything else with Hitler. They're excluded from government employment. They're subjected to economic discrimination. In some cases, of course, victims of a terror attack, violent attacks. The minority rights proved too weak that the League of Nations was trying to help enforce, proved too weak and too ineffective to really protect the Jews. Now, I mentioned last time that the Balfour Declaration eventually becomes part of a law, more or less. And I said we get to that, so I'm going to do that now. It was incorporated into the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. The British are given a mandate, that's why it was called the British Mandate, to govern this country of Palestine. It was granted them in 1920, formally goes into effect in 1923. They had legal international responsibility for the citizens, the people living in Palestine at the time, to facilitate the development of a Jewish national home in Palestine, while also administering all the benefits of its inhabitants. In other words, putting the Balfour Declaration becomes part of the law of the British Mandate. It's not just a nice paper. His Majesty looks with favor upon the establishment of the Jewish homeland, etc. Now it's enshrined in law. It has a legal standing. It went from being a nice paper that was agreed upon to having legal status, international responsibility. But there's also a contradiction in the obligations. On the one hand, it would generate decades of, because on the one hand, there has to be a homeland for the Jews. On the other hand, you have millions of Arabs living in the country. So this contradiction, of course, of the obligation of the British leads to terrible consequences and decades to this very day of conflict, and which started with 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Before that, it's worth noting that the 1929 massacre in Hebron, which was during the time period of the British Mandate. If you know the little bit of what happened there, if you don't, it's definitely worth your while to go to Hebron to learn on the spot there what happened with this massacre. It wouldn't have been a massacre had the British actually put into practice what they were supposed to do. After X amount of days, hours/days of the Jews being massacred, murdered, maimed, attacked, it literally took one bullet into the air from a British officer, policeman, I don't remember which, and it stopped. That was it. Go home, done, end. So yes, on the one hand, it was very good. It was a legal status of the paper of the Balfour Declaration, but at the same time, when it came to Tachlis, things didn't work out as great for the Jews. What about the American Jews? What was going on? This has all been Eastern Europe, Russia, what's going on, the chopping of the country and the Treaty of Versailles and all these other things. What about the American Jews? So the end of the war had a very, I say, complex effect on the Jews in the United States. On the one hand, it accelerated the Americanization, if there's such a word, of the Jewish immigrant community. Because remember what we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago was about 250,000 Jews from the United States served in the army. So it was part of their, like, remember, part of the reason that some of the Jews wanted to be this to show, see, we can also be patriotic, that we would not be able to be charged with dual loyalty because there's Jews in Palestine and there's Jews in the United States. It was their military experience would serve as a very powerful American experience as far as American identification. The war industry itself had drawn Jews to broader economic ways and success. And the Yiddish press was enthusiastically pro-American, especially after the February Revolution of the Tsar, from the Tsar. On the other hand, don't paint such a rosy picture. There's a very short, or not was short, but a sharp turn of anti-immigrant sentiment in America, American politics, with very dire consequences for the Jews. The Jews were associated with radicalism, Bolshevism, obviously unfair and unwarranted, but it reinforced the popular perception because of the prominence of the Jews that were involved in the Russian Revolution. So automatically, just like today, you're Jewish, you're therefore in the United States, you're associated with Israel, therefore you're Zionist, therefore you're no good, and you deserve to have whatever happens to you. So too back then, in the early 1900s, late, let's say in the 20s, the association, guilt by association, you're Jewish and there were Bolshevik Revolution, there are Jews involved in that as well, you're also not a good person. It came to a head with a very specific act in Congress. It was known as the Johnson-Reed Act, or the Immigration Act of 1924. It established quotas. I don't know if it was the first time, because I didn't look, but it becomes a repeating theme from now in the 1920s until after World War II. The concept of quotas designed to reduce immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and to preserve existing composition of the American population. Now, what did it mean that there were quotas? What is a quota? So the quota for immigrants in Poland, 3 million plus Jews lived in Poland. What was the number that the Holy Congress of the United States allowed per year from these 3 million Jews to come to the United States? You might think, okay, 10%, 8%, 5%. The number was 6,524 people, which I did the math, I have it here, 0.0000217%. Put it in perspective. If it was Israel, it would be about, which let's say round about 10 million people, it would be 2,180 people, about the amount of people that live in the neighborhood here in Spendevo. So it was a fraction. The quota for Russia was only 2,248 people at a time where there were millions of Jews in East Europe that were desperately looking to emigrate and go to the United States to get out of the country. Now, you would think that, and it was theoretically true of all people, any Poles, but how many Poles were looking to emigrate? It was mostly the Jews that were looking to get away from their horrible lives. So it was effectively closing the gates to the United States. The consequences, of course, were catastrophic. The First World War transformed Jewish political consciousness as well in ways that are still reverberate to today. The pre-war confidence of the American assimilated Jew, the promise of emancipation, that was shaken to its core. German Jewish soldiers came back to, Germany, and all of a sudden are faced eventually with the Nuremberg laws, which, again, if you're not familiar, we will get to that. The Russian Jews found themselves victims of Stalinist persecution. Jews in the Pale who had survived the war now are pogroms in their country. Zionism emerges as enormously strengthened for good reason, very much why we've seen since October 7th a huge surge in Aliyah, and rightfully so. The Ottoman Empire's collapse allows or opens the door for more Jews to immigrate to to Israel or to Palestine under British protection. And again, eventually there's quotas and everything else they learned from the United States. And membership in various organizations of Zionism, which we talked about a long time ago when we did the history of Zionism, starts to build tremendously. And now, with hindsight, we can talk about they had the Zionist Congress, which was started way before this in the late 1800s. And now, only about 30 years later, there's this giant swell of growth of interest in Zionism. Now you can start putting these pieces together, that Lego game, as I showed a couple weeks ago. But the seeds of the Holocaust are now being planted. The question of the war's relationship to the Holocaust, which is something we're going to have to deal with once we go into the interwar year, is a big question. The connections are real. The connections are significant. The First World War did not cause the Holocaust, because the Holocaust is a product of specific decisions made by certain people, specific political movements. But the First World War created the environment or the conditions wherein the Holocaust could become possible. So we're leaving it with this tonight, Bezrat Hashem, is as follows. The First World War comes to an end in a catastrophic way for the Jews for quite a period of time. It's and also very unfriendly to immigrants and minorities in many countries. It ends with by the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles chopping up Europe to new countries, which some don't exist anymore, as we said, with planting seeds for what's going to become eventually the Holocaust. So from the two bookends of World War I and World War II, that's the time period we're going to deal with starting B'ezrat Hashem next week. And that will take us a number of weeks to go through before we get anywhere near the Holocaust. And in the meantime, we'll end on a good note. We don't have to talk about the Holocaust. It's going to be a painful time to talk about, obviously. But just wishing everyone only good news. And we should all grow from the past experience of what we've seen and just move forward with all kinds of good things. Have a good evening, everybody.